Hi. Um, I was told that you possess this ancient knowledge from your people, and that you might be able to help me figure out what's haunting me.
You were told, huh? What is it? A cryptid? A spirit?
I'm not sure.
Describe it to me.
Well, it's large, like 12 feet or so, and it's got these large hands, and its skin is like this greenish hue.
Hmm.
And it looks like it has horns like, coming out the side of its head, or, I mean, maybe they're ears. I'm not really sure. And the weird thing is, I'm pretty sure it's wearing clothes, like this white shirt and pants, which makes me think it might be a ghost or a spirit or something.
Do you happen to live in or near a swamp?
Yeah?
And is this the thing that is haunting you?
Oh, yeah, that's it. What is it?
It is an ancient being. Offer it onions and just leave wherever you are now.
That was a really fun last minute idea I had. I want to thank my friend Isabo and my friend Lucas, two really great friends who jumped in last minute to help me film this thing. And I wanted to film that because it's making fun of what I'm going to talk about here in a bit. So, the first one, like I mentioned already, is the ancient Indian burial ground. And of course, I'm sure you've seen this one plenty of times. In more popular culture, like, more mainstream things, it's been used in quite a few texts. When I say texts, I mean like the actual media, right? It was used in Pet Sematary, again, like I said, The Shining. It was parodied in The Simpsons in the very first Treehouse of Horror. And it's even used to explain kind of the lore in Silent Hill, both in the video games and the films. This trope, it's an interesting one as it is overused. Now, there's no real metric to understand really why this trope is used so much or why it's used at all. But again, with the history and the origins, like I said, we can kind of speculate why. The explanation can be boiled down to two things. The first one is just purely colonial guilt over the dispossession of native peoples from their ancestral homelands. This has been speculated in a lot of articles and theses that this type of anxiety of Americans is predominant and reflected in a lot of these films when it comes to knowing and understanding that you, as an American settler, that you are living on native land. The other one is a morbid curiosity and this exoticism about indigenous people overall in all of the colonial Americas. For some reason, ancient civilizations and ancient peoples fascinate people. I mean, they interest me too, right? But the problem is that this trope perpetuates the idea that native peoples are the evil antagonists even in death. It makes us inhuman still. Here is a wild line in the first Poltergeist film.
We own all the land. We've already made arrangements for relocating the cemetery.
Oh, you're kidding. Oh, come on. I mean, that's sacrilegious, isn't it?
Oh, don't worry about it. After all, it's not ancient tribal burial ground. It's just people.
So yeah, I mean, that right there, it kind of explains that the hauntings aren't necessarily caused by an ancient Indian burial ground. But what he says is so weird to me. It's oh, it wasn't some ancient Indian burial ground. These are just people. Right? And it's you could take that two ways. You could think that well, he's not comparing ancient natives to people. You know what I mean? But it's just an odd choice for them to say that in that film. It kind of makes it seem natives aren't people. But at the same time, they it's suggested that they would have respected the fact that it's an ancient Indian burial ground or something. I don't know. It's just a weird line. So like I said before, like with this phenomenon, again, there's been tons of articles written about the whole white guilt thing. But the problem is they don't necessarily touch on the origins of kind of the original obsession with ancient native burial sites and burial mounds in, early America. And I think when you look at it in that lens, you're able to understand a little bit more as to why this trope continues to be perpetuated. The other trope that is often seen and used in American horror is the indigenous cryptid. And now this one has been around in more recent days, probably the last 30 years or so, or for even 40 years, with the growing popularity of cryptids such as the Wendigo and the Skinwalker, and actually even Bigfoot. The Wendigo is indigenous to the Algonquin-speaking tribes, and it's, for some odd reason, has just been the one that's been the most used often. A couple of examples of where it's been used in any popular media, obviously, like I said, Pet Sematary, the video game Until Dawn, who, the Wendigo is the main antagonist. I think it's like the second or third episode of Supernatural, where we get, Sam and Dean going to a native elder and asking guidance of how to get rid of a Wendigo. Another one, which is a film that has Guy Price in it, called Ravenous. As a film, it's a really great film. It's a very compelling film, right? It suffers from casting away kind of its indigenous roots. The Wendigo actually has been used in comics too, with the X-Men series. The issue in which he appears in the X-Men, where he fights the Hulk, is the first issue we see with Wolverine. A pretty interesting one that the Wendigo is like a specific person or a specific creature, like a nemesis of Hulk's. Its indigenous origins are vaguely represented. The Wendigo is the antagonist in My Little Pony of all shows, right?
What is that thing? They must be Wendigos. Wendigos? My mentor, Star Swirl the Bearded, taught me about them. They're winter spirits that feed off fighting and hatred.
It just goes to show like how far the Wendigo has reached in the modern day in its representation and its influence among pretty much the rest of the world. Skinwalkers. Now, Skinwalkers are fairly unique to my tribe, but they've also kind of had this international appeal, and it was seen in Supernatural, but again, its indigenous roots I don't think they're even acknowledged at all. And then we get a few PBS documentaries. Animal Planet did their Lost Tapes on the Skinwalker. That one was actually pretty good. Obviously, like Hunt for the Skinwalker, which doesn't really talk about the Skinwalker really. It talks more about the ranch. And then probably one of the more accurate representations of, or things surrounding the Skinwalker is PBS's Skinwalkers, which is a adaptation of Tony Hillerman's novel, starring Wes Studi as Detective Leaphorn and Adam Beach as Officer Chi. It's a really good adaptation. A little cheesy, but it's interesting. However, like with the Skinwalker, there hasn't been a uniquely Navajo thing about it so far. It's just there. So again, another thing that's, a cryptid that kind of has indigenous roots and, is the Chupacabra. There's actually a film literally called Indigenous, and it's about a bunch of, American tourists going somewhere in South America, I don't know where, and they enter like this abandoned temple of sorts, supposed to be like a Mayan temple, and there's a creature in there that's hunting them, and apparently it's supposed to be like a chupacabra. It doesn't try to present any uniqueness to the chupacabra at all, and I wouldn't say maybe it has strictly indigenous roots, unless somebody out there knows that the chupacabra in particular has indigenous roots. Let me know, because I personally don't. No, I think the legend of the Chupacabra kind of came within the past 50, 60 years or so. So I don't know, someone tell me. There's another interesting one called Wolfen. It was made in the 80s. It's a very underrated film. It's marketed as like a werewolf film, but the werewolves, they don't transform. They're just giant man-eating wolves. Again, it's a white character going to a native person, and the native person gives them exposition about these creatures. The lore that is around it is actually fascinating, but again, it falls into that whole thing where, the non-native person who lives in the city winds up kind of saving the day in the end, or the whole story is centered around them. But regardless, I would check it out. It's actually a pretty underrated one. So again, going back to what I just said, like with a lot of these representations of these cryptids or creatures, oftentimes we have to have a native character or even another non-native person give some sort of exposition or fill them in about the creature. I mean, literally, it happens in Antlers, which is out now. I'm actually gonna do my own review on it later after I watch it. I haven't seen it yet. We literally see that in the trailer. It's the same cliche. Indigenous characters are either killed off or they're only shown once to give that exposition, and then that's purely really it. And this is the fascinating thing with indigenous cryptids and creatures. We don't have any real representations of them in their indigenous worlds. Other than the PBS thing, we don't have a Navajo perspective of the Skinwalker. We don't have, you know, an Algonquin perspective of the Wendigo. We don't have, you know, indigenous perspectives about Bigfoot. You know, Bigfoot or Sasquatch is, you know, considered a sacred being to many different tribes. He's even a clan. The last trope, which I think is an interesting one, is simply using general indigenous lore as a reason for, you know, the supernatural occurrences happening. Now, when I say this, you know, this is separating both the Indian burial ground and the cryptid. This one is unique because it uses aspects of indigenous mysticism to explain that something bad is happening. Usually something bad, right? There's just a really dumb film called The Darkness with Kevin Bacon. And that one, I'm surprised it was made when it was made. I think it was made like in 2014 or 15. And it somehow tries to explain that like this kid finds these rocks in an Anasazi cave and like he is accidentally releasing like the 4 Anasazi horsemen of the apocalypse. It's ridiculous. And like very similar to Poltergeist, they have someone try to do an exorcism. The lady is like a Mexican shaman woman. And I don't know, it felt weird. It just felt completely just borderline disrespectful. Like because one of the creatures or the gods that are supposed to bring about the apocalypse is actually modeled after a very sacred figure in Navajo theology. You know, they saw some spooky looking pictures online and then made their own thing from it. Anyways, that's my rant for that film. If you want to watch it, go ahead. I don't know. There's a Twilight does this as well. Now, I understand what Stephanie Meyer was going for with the wolves, but again, she was kind of taking from the Skinwalker idea. You know, I appreciate her effort in trying to make it into, you know, the indigenous lore, but it's just weird. I felt like Stephanie Meyer was a little disconnected with Native peoples when creating the lore around it. And Poltergeist 2. Now, Poltergeist 2 is an interesting one because it tries to make a statement. Actually, it does make a statement about the evils of kind of religious fanaticism with the old priest guy. What this does, it kind of sets up this kind of noble Indian versus the bad white man. You know what I mean? And sure, that's kind of cool, but the native guy in Poltergeist, played by Will Sampson, he kind of becomes the noble savage character, right? He is this mystical Indian. He always gives this wisdom and advice to this white family, right? And like, while I appreciate the sentiment, it still comes off as that's all he has to offer. Kind of, again, like other Native peoples in these horror films, you know, a set piece. Now, I may not be too fair, but as an indigenous person, that's just what I see. And like, yeah, he's kind of an outsider still. He doesn't feel, you know, included all too much. The family still kind of looks at him weird. There's a weird interaction between him and the mom where he's teaching this young boy tenets of being a man, and the mom kind of freaks out and says, I want my kids to be normal and stuff like that. It's just kind of condescending. So what can we learn from all of these representations and my nitty-gritty critiques of them all, right? Well, it's to simply acknowledge that these representations usually put the Native perspective on the back burner. Either vaguely acknowledge the indigenous origins or just kind of throw it out altogether. And in many cases, these tropes just come across as cheap. I think it's really cool and interesting when horror, if it's using some type of lore, I think it's even more interesting when the lore is completely made up, or if it's taking place within a certain cultural context that they're using and respecting the actual lore, which is one of the reasons why I really enjoyed Robert Eager's The Witch, because it didn't put natives as the antagonists. It was more interested in kind of telling the story from the perspective of this family. And if you really know kind of the esoteric elements in it and knowing a bit about old world paganism in the minds of the people at that time, it makes a lot more sense. And I just personally think it's a more fascinating film because of that. There are a lot richer themes and character studies and engaging plots that can be derived from looking at these indigenous lores from an indigenous perspective. There's a really interesting film called Blood Quantum, which is a zombie apocalypse horror slasher flick directed by Jeff Barnaby, and he really utilizes his cultural viewpoint to kind of shape the world that Blood Quantum is in, but it uniquely tries to talk about a real world phenomenon in this post-apocalyptic space. I would argue it suffered from the story just a little, but the fact that this film was made is interesting. You get a unique horror film from an indigenous perspective. You know, it's an interesting one, and I want to see more of that. So another thing too of why I think these representations can be problematic, the lore that is used in this horror media is taking something from indigenous cultures that is very real for modern indigenous people today. I do like, I saw the trailer for Antlers and they're asking about the Wendigo. The police officers says, well, this is just a myth. And then Graham Greene says,
for you, yeah.
I like that they acknowledge that, but it's pretty meta that the fact that like the protagonists for this film are non-native folk. But that's just the one thing too that I wanted to acknowledge, is that like a lot of these things that are used in popular media are very real things for indigenous peoples today. Skinwalkers are a very real phenomenon for lots of people in the Southwest. The Wendigo phenomenon is a real thing for lots of people. There's lots of films out there that grossly misappropriate Catholicism to tell a story, right? And I would argue that people who are Catholic would probably feel a little offended or a little jaded and like, why is my faith being portrayed this way, if that makes sense, to put it in a different perspective. So that's it. That's my rant. And that's it. I know this one was really long, but there's a lot to talk about when it comes to this subject in particular. And I thank you so much if you stuck around, and go ahead, like, share, subscribe if you want to. I want to keep doing more skits down the road to help illustrate certain aspects of Indigenous representation. And let me know in the comments and on Instagram, what other forms of media have you seen that either misappropriates Indigenous lore or even does it respectfully? Let me know. There's a lot more out there that I don't know about, and I'd love to learn more about it. But yeah, and happy Halloween.